We're now going to be creating a foreground grass ecosystem, a nice ground cover with high resolution details in order to render view vegetation close up and make it look realistic. Before we start designing the plants, there are a couple of things I want to cover that are really important. First of all, it's having to do with the view unit as of version 8. So if you're using a version of Vue prior to version 8, 7 or 6, anything that has a unit definition. So if you go to File, Options, and under Units and Coordinates, in the Unit section, we have one unit, one view unit is 1 meter with the metric automatic mode. This is the new default as of version 8. Prior versions had an internal unit, as it was previously called, of 0.1. The plants were all created within this internal unit, so all of the stuff and all of the plants that come with Vue were created with that internal unit of 0.1, and that's really important because it's going to modify the scale of the plants. So with the terrain in the scene, what I'm going to do is just add in an ecosystem and add in a plant. I'm going to go ahead and select a tree and add a maple tree. And you can see that the scale is 0.1. So the default scale should be whatever the internal unit was to create it. So in order to keep your scales correct between the native species and anything you customize, you want to make sure that the scene you're working on the vegetation in is going to have that unit of 0.1. So we're going to have two separate scenes, one for designing the vegetation and one for modifying the ecosystem. We could also switch back and forth with changing the unit within the main scene as we edit plants, but it's just a little easier to have two separate scenes. So if I populate this, this is going to be the actual size of the plant at 0.1, or the relative size, since the ecosystem itself does modify the scale a little bit. So if I load in the maple tree, we can see the base size, and it looks like maybe the OpenGL billboards are possibly too large. They do look a bit larger than the actual scene or the render. So let's just take a look. And it is a little different, but it's still pretty close. This scale is really quite relative because it does change throughout the ecosystem. This tree is 20 meters, and it is going to have a variation within itself, the objects that are generated from the ecosystem growth, and also the ecosystem itself under scaling and orientation. We have a maximum size variation. If I change this to 0, now all the plants are going to be their original size, no scale changes whatsoever, except for the solid growth species changes that each individual plant is slightly a different size. So you can see they're really close, and it's definitely not a 10 times scale difference. It's only a very small change. So if you're using a version of Vue prior to version 8, you'll want to make sure that the ecosystem scale is set to 1, and you will be by default working within view unit of 0.1. We will need to change this setting. So we're going to set it to 0.1 meters, apply new settings to the current scene. And if I go ahead and select this maple tree and we take a look at the scale, we're going to see that its height is no longer 20 meters, it is now 2 meters, because we've changed the entire unit scale of the entire scene. If I go ahead and load in another maple tree, we're going to see one that's 10 times larger, and this one is going to be relative to that unit system that we've defined. So now this one is 20 meters, but it would actually be about 200 compared to the original creation of the rest of the scene. So just something to pay attention to. What I'm going to do is just revert this back to my prior version of this scene. It's just a blank scene, default, and set my one view unit is zero point 0.1 meters. Apply new settings to the current scene, click OK. And what we're going to do is start modifying the plant species. Now, there's something else you also need to keep in mind, and that has to do with the wind and breeze. Anytime you're modifying a plant, and either the wind or breeze setting, if you go to Atmosphere, Atmosphere Editor, and under the Wind tab, if Enable Wind on a per plant basis and Enable Breeze is turned on, actually it doesn't really matter which one is turned on. So we're going to keep the breeze and wind on for the moment, and pick our first plant we're going to be editing, and then I'll go ahead and show you what happens with the wind on or off. Also, the internal wind settings within the plant and the influence don't really have an impact, and you'll see that in a second. So if you go to Grasses and Plants, what we're going to do is load in the Lily of the Valley. So right-click to load a plant species. If you're using Xtreme integrated within the host within your host application, you'll be the Load Plant from Species command to open up the plant browser. So Control E on the keyboard will edit the plant. You can double-click on it, right-click, Edit Object. You will need to select the Edit Object command if you're within Xtreme in the host application. This plant has 5 different subsets, each for the leaves. It also has 2 subsets for the subset 0 and 1, which are the stem and kind of the base of the stem. What we're going to do is modify the leaves and petals, all subsets, so that we can modify all 5 of those. And we're going to change the width and increase the length. Now we are going to be setting up our own custom image maps for the textures, but first just modifying with the default leaf surface, and then we can adjust the flexibility and the curl amount. Okay, so if we take a look, we can see a pretty thin leaf, and I'm going to go ahead and render this really quick. And you can see it is matching the OpenGL. At least for the most part. If we go back into the plant editor and select the edit wind or the response to wind options, I'm going to go ahead and change the sensitivity to the leaves, the breeze to 0, and set both of these just to 0, and click OK. And go ahead and render it, and we're basically going to see the same render. And you can see that's still turned on. Now if we go to the Atmosphere Editor, and under Wind, if we turn off both the breeze and the wind, and in this case it looks like maybe it just hasn't updated. If we go to edit the object and take a look, if we do grow a new plant and take a look, because we are going to be creating this within an ecosystem, so of course we're going to be growing new plants constantly. You can see that everything is widened up because of the wind and breeze settings being off. When they're on, whether or not they have an influence on the plant, they are going to modify the width of the leaves, or in some cases the length, depending on where the hooking point is placed. So going back, if we set this to 0, really no change. But one thing to keep in mind is when you do grow a new plant, it will reset these values to the defaults of the plant species. So if you do modify them, you will need to save a new plant species in order for it to work within an ecosystem with those values. So now going back to the Atmosphere Editor, turning on the wind and breeze, and now you can see once those settings are turned on, it immediately changes the look of the plant. And now if I go back and edit the object and set those values to 0 within the wind response, and then go back and turn on the wind and breeze, we can see the same thing happen. So even though there's supposed to be no influence, it does modify the overall look. So really stretching it out. So we're going to need to really set this up to be as flexible as possible. And the way we can do that is, like I was saying before, it doesn't matter which setting is on. If we leave or turn off the breeze, and if you're unfamiliar with the differences between the wind and breeze, the breeze is just overall kind of gusts of wind, fluttering of leaves and branches, and wind is anytime we have a ventilator object. So go ahead and just add it in, our ventilator, and now it is affecting the plant differently because I do have those wind settings turned off. We'll go ahead and grow a new plant, and now the ventilator is pretty much blowing away the entire plant. So we're going to go ahead and reduce the intensity down to 1 just for now. And now as we move this around, we can see its influence on the plant. This is the wind. This is one way of modifying wind, is with a ventilator. The other type of wind is if you select the object and go to the top view, you're going to see a little handle, and this is the wind handle. This is so you can modify the wind manually and control the direction on each individual plant. So to allow this to work for stills and for animation, whether or not you want the wind or breeze on, since the wind itself is pretty much manually controlled by either ventilators or that handle up on the top, if you have just the breeze turned off, you won't have any plant motion unless those manual settings are defined. So that's really the best way to create your species, is just to, you can turn off the breeze because the settings, that's really going to be scene dependent. But when you design your plants, enable wind, and that way you can design them correctly, because otherwise they're going to change their width. So making sure too that when you load these plants into the scene, you make sure that at least enable wind on a per plant basis is turned on. So we're going to go ahead and just drag that wind handle back to the center and kind of reset it. So we're going to be modifying this for just that wind setting. The breeze is not turned on, so we won't see any fluttering in animation unless we turn that setting on. But at least we know we're going to be designing this to work correctly and not be changing its scale if we go ahead and turn the wind off, and that way we don't have unexpected results. So I'm going to go ahead and just change the randomness a little bit, add a little bit of flexibility to the plant. And we can see this is going to work very nicely for a tight grouping of grass, where we're going to have a nice high-res model curling per each individual grass stalk. And we see a very low polygon version showing, but of course once we render it, it is a higher resolution. And you could either stick with the default surface for this, but what I want to do is create a custom texture map that's going to look much better for grass. So I'm going to go ahead and just save the scene in the current state, and then we're going to switch over to Photoshop and take a look at modifying the texture. Now, unfortunately, Photoshop and View tend to have some issues when run at the same time. So I'm going to close out View after I've saved. And really having Photoshop open in the background when View is running can cause some lag and slowdown with View scenes, and typically In a lot of cases, you'll have to close down View, close down Photoshop, or restart View in order to be able to get your system response back for video settings. So I'm using Photoshop CS4 Extended. Pretty much any of the CS versions will work for the tools I'm going to be using for the most part. There are going to be a few better ways of getting the final maps within CS3 and up because of the quick selection tool. So if you need to, you might have to do a little hand editing or go and cleaning up images. If you don't have access to an image editing application, there are links included with the training in the menu. There's a program called the GIMP, which is a free image editing application, and it'll allow you to do pretty much everything you can do in Photoshop for the most part. There's a lot of different add-ons you can get to add more functionality. It's a really good image editing application. So there's a link if you need to download that if you don't have access to a major image editing application. So what we're going to do is start with a photographic reference and create a texture for our leaves, starting from that. In the project content folder included with the training, under source images, you'll find one called Blade of Grass, TIFF file. And go ahead and load that in, and this is the image I have right now. This is a source from a scanner where I went ahead and scanned a blade of grass. Now because it's just a single blade, I did use just like a white sheet of paper over the top of it, pressing it down in order to remove any of the shadows that would show up behind it. But when you're going to be grouping, if you do decide to use a scanner to scan blades of grass, because it can be really effective for creating really nice texture maps, typically a different background color is more useful. I do want to show you one of my other scans. This was used for the ground cover collection view plants that I created, and finding the right background color was somewhat trial and error. Just tried a couple of different things first, and really red was the best. I just took a piece of red construction paper and stuck it over the top and made sure I pressed down in order to remove as much of the shadows as possible that show up. The red was really useful because other colors were absorbing too much of the green, and it was making it very difficult to create an alpha or a mask in order to clip out the grass. So the red became the easiest way to be able to separate the two colors, and I could just go ahead and show you right now how the alpha was basically created. There were quite a few steps to finish this one because there were so many tiny details. But basically, just even going to image adjustments, black and white, and just adjusting these where red is in an opposite direction of the other colors. And of course you can see there is a bit of dust and some other fragments showing up. So even running an image filter first to clean it up can be really helpful, but for the most part you should be able to get what you need really quickly with a nice red background. One thing that is very helpful is just starting with dust and scratches. Now keep in mind this would be just for an alpha, so you'd want to create a duplicate layer before running any filters, and that way you don't destroy any of the color map. So what we do is we'll start with dust and scratches, just at a radius of, go ahead and bump it up to 2 and see what it looks like. You do want it to be, for the most part, smooth, but not to the point where you're removing too many details. But this does remove a lot of that overall noise. Another thing that's helpful is just setting up an auto levels in order to be able to increase the contrast. Another thing that can be helpful is using the vibrance filter and increasing the saturation and vibrance of the color, and that really helps pull out and really separate those colors. So next, another thing you do is go to Image Adjustments and use Replace Color. Select the shadow area, just where we have that bit of shadow. We don't want that to be part of the image, so we want to cut that out. So just select it, increase the fuzziness amount, and what you can do is just increase the saturation and the lightness. And also make sure that you switch over the eyedropper to the subtract and select the green, and that way it doesn't come into the plant at all. And it looks like maybe I need to select more towards the edge for the initial color. And you might even need to do more than one step. Just making sure we subtract any of the yellow or green. And then we can click OK. So now we have a very defined map that we can use. And going back over to black and white, now we can see something that looks a lot more like an alpha. So with those increased color changes, we have less of areas within the image that don't really have a whole lot of color or saturation, and it makes it more difficult to define the map. So now there's a little bit of cleanup that will need to be done. There's a little bit of dust on the scanner, so we could just go ahead and paint over that or erase it. Whenever you're working in View, you do want to make sure you're using a black and white image and not a grayscale image, so it will actually end up needing to be two different colors, and there are still some in-between values. So if we open up the levels, we can do some further adjustments in order to match that a little better. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit first so we can look at some of the other areas. And it can be a little grainy in some spots, but we'll be able to clean that up with a filter. So dust and scratches works pretty good. We'll set it down to 1. Reduce noise works well. So it's still not quite 2 colors. The easiest way to make sure that that operation is performed is I'm just going to go to the history and create a duplicate from the current state. And I haven't cleaned up any of those scratches yet, or dust, so you'll still see those showing up, but we just want to make sure that we have something that's going to be black and white. So what we can do is switch over our mode under Image, and first convert it to Grayscale, and we'll go ahead and merge, and actually we can go ahead and flatten. So layer and then flatten, so the only layer we have is the alpha now. And go to Mode, select Bitmap, and then we're going to set our threshold. 50% threshold is going to work pretty well. And we're going to keep the resolution the same. So now we have just 2 different colors, because View does require this. Any in-between value will cause flickering, transparency around the edges, and will take longer to render. So this is basically the alpha. What we could also do is go ahead and copy it, or we can duplicate the layer. Right now it's merged, so we can't quite do that. Also, if you want to switch it back to a grayscale, you can. It's still going to be 2 separate colors since we already converted it to a bitmap and converted it back. And now going back to this image, If we go ahead and add a mask to that layer, and then within the paths, or sorry, within channels, we see layer 0 mask. We can turn that on, select the layer, paste, and then go ahead and click into the layer, and then we'll see that applied. So if there's any cleanup that needs to be done, you can just modify this new mask directly. May need to go, or make sure you go back and convert it back to the black and white, so there's no in-between values. But another thing is to replace the background with color that is similar to the current color. We don't want that red showing up, because as the MIP mapping is reducing the scale of the textures, because the alpha is so thin, it's going to start to bleed through and show that red color outline as we get farther away from the object. So what we want to do is just create a sample, or just grab the eyedropper tool and select the color portion in the image, and we can just add a new layer underneath the current one. Just use the paint bucket and fill it in. So now it's just a matter of cropping off the sides that aren't needed. Also, this is a huge texture, may not need it this large, so what you can do is reduce the image scale. Also, maybe clean up the color a bit if you want a better or a higher contrast. We'll take a look at that more with the single blade. And I can go ahead and close this other version. So this one doesn't really have much of a shadow, so it's not going to be that difficult to modify or to extract our alpha from it. What we're going to do is double click on the layer in order, or the background, in order to create a layer, and then we're going to convert it to a smart object. So right click, convert to smart object, Control T for free transform, or using the marquee tool, you can right click and free transform. So we just want to straighten this out. I'm going to go ahead and add a guide. Control R to turn rulers on and off, and you can just pull the guide in from the side. And this is going to make it easier for us to line up the top and the bottom, so that for the most part it's straight. We'll take a look at variations a little bit later. So now that looks like it should be good. What we're going to do is clear the guides. So from view, clear guides, just get rid of them. And then go ahead and crop. So using the crop tool, we're going to cut out the portions we don't need. So coming down the bottom, leaving a little bit of a gap, and then going in and cropping in on the sides. And now this is also a very large image, so we'll end up scaling it down, but I am going to do that after I create the alpha in order to get as accurate of an alpha and as close to the edge as I can. Now there are a couple of different ways to extract this individual blade and separate it from the background, where we can see that grain of the paper that I had used on top of it when I scanned. One tool, if you're using Photoshop CS3 and higher, is the Quick Selection tool. So it's found within the Magic Wand tool, and what we can do is select it and just go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and turn on Auto Enhance. And we could just come down the side and selecting just the white areas. And that looks like it's selected pretty good. I am going to go ahead and hold on the Alt key and just go along the part of the stem up at the top, the little point. Now we'll need to reduce the size of the brush a little bit. And I'm just going to go ahead and zoom in, Z on the keyboard for the zoom select tool. And just going back to the quick selection tool, holding down Alt and removing a bit of the selection up at the top. And this is a pretty small brush. I'll probably go back and clean that up. That should be good. At least to start with. And then what we're going to do is use the Refine Edge. So I'm just going to switch over the Marquee tool and right-click, Refine Edge. And now we can adjust, based on this selection, how far into the surface we want to clip it. I'm going to go ahead and smooth it out a bit, increase the radius of the edge refine. And we can just move along, taking a look, and seeing how far we're going in. So expanding the selection a little bit more into it in order to remove the blend into that white paper behind it. So maybe just a little bit more. And as long as our contrast is up high enough, the smoothing won't produce too much of a grayscale or in between, and that's something we can edit afterwards anyway. So go ahead and click OK, and now we have that selection, and what we can do is click the Create Quick Mask, so just adding a mask, and that's going to be based on the selection. Now I do need to invert this, so I can select the mask and Control I to invert. And now we have that cropped up. So I'm going to be setting up basically the same background as I did before. There are different ways to do it. One good way is to create a duplicate of the layer and put it behind the current one, getting stretch out. I'm going to go ahead and just create a quick duplicate and rasterize the layer, because we're not going to be transforming that one anymore. We can take that new layer, and I'm going to go ahead and change my panel options so that you can see the thumbnails a little bit larger. Because it is pretty thin, it can be kind of difficult to see. So with the still smart object underneath now, I'm going to free transform and just go ahead and stretch it out. And it looks like I'm having a little bit of trouble finding the selection. Go ahead and select the crop tool, make sure it's set to delete, and crop out any extra edges. And what we can do is just stretch this out to fill the entire canvas. I'll go ahead and zoom out a bit. And we can now rasterize this smart object. And we've got a nice background fill for match color. So then we can add over and turn back on the primary layer. And we're really just using the mask right now in order to give us an idea of what it's going to look like when it's clipped out. As you can see, there is a bit of color difference between the two different layers. So what we can do is select the bottom layer, just hit Control L, pull up levels, and we can just reduce the black output and change the gamma a little bit in order to match it to the edges. So it is a bit lighter because it does get lighter around the edges. We want it to be fairly close. It doesn't have to be perfect. but as long as it's just not that white background, that's the most important thing. So that's matched up pretty well, and that'll work for a grass blade. I do highly suggest having two different images, one for the color and one for the alpha, and make sure they're separated. When you start using embedded alphas within Vue, and you start modifying links between transparency output or the alpha output of a texture map and the output node, there are some issues with OS compatibility, and the images, even if incorporated, the alphas may not show up properly and may not be saved properly. So it's a good idea to have the two separate ones. It does work out much better. It is two separate files, but overall Vue does work better with the two separate files. So what I'm going to do is create another duplicate of that top layer, because we are going to be pulling out the mask from it in just a minute. We can now merge these together. So selecting layer 0 and 0 copy in the bottom two, and then Control E on the keyboard to merge them. Now, if you do want to set up additional maps, like a bump map, anything like that, now because we're working with grass and we're going to have a lot of these textures showing up, adding a bump map is really going to increase render time, and we could pretty effectively use a noise in order to take care of the bump. But in case you do want to create a bump map, it's a good idea to save your current place with the mask that you have, so you can use that in order to kind of shape out an overall edge or curvature to the blade of grass. Selecting this layer 0, which I'm going to go ahead and rename color. What we can do is go to levels, Control L, and take a look. Go into auto and just see if these methods look a little bit better. So using the enhance monochromatic contrast, it gives us a much brighter green. If we go to per channel contrast, we've got something a little more blue. So you could modify the color that way, or you could just go up to the top and set an auto contrast. That'll work pretty nicely and give you a good tone. Also, setting up the gamma, so going to image adjustments and exposure, we could modify the gamma as well and bring it down to 0.5. It might be a little dark, and then increase the exposure a little bit. So let's go ahead and bring the exposure up to 0.3. Our gamma correction is at 0.65. Go ahead and click OK. And then I'm going to go up and apply vibrance, so image adjustment and vibrance. And we'll increase vibrance by about 20, saturation by about 3 to 5. We don't want any oversaturation. You could also stick with the original colors if you want. It's really kind of up to you, and depending on the lighting situation. You will have to basically apply these sort of filters to every image map you create in order to have a nice balance between them. So what I'm going to do now is save out the color and the alpha separately. I'm going to create a duplicate document from the current state, and what I can do is select that alpha or the mask on that first layer. So making sure that's selected, Control A on the keyboard to select all, Control C to copy, and Control V to paste. And we can convert this over to Grayscale. We can merge it. So we're going to go ahead and save the alpha. Save as, turn off layers, as a copy. We'll keep the profile in there. Now, the location in which you save the images um, isn't super important because we are going to be incorporating the texture maps. It's more important where the actual plant is saved in order to make sure that if you're going to be running it across different systems, that content licenses work correctly. One thing you can do if you want to make sure that the textures are going to load correctly when sent over to other systems, or if you're distributing plants, you can save them in the view directory within one of the preset content folders. So what I'm going to do is, this is the content folder for within bitmaps. So this is the main content installation. Go to bitmaps, and I'm going to create a new folder and call it vegetation, and then save everything within that folder. And then add that collection in. It's part of the main collection, so it should show up within view automatically. But this will make sure too that any scenes that are saved with the texture maps not incorporated, that if you do have the image maps and you put them in the identical folder within the content installation, it shouldn't have to search around per system directory in order to find it. So I'm going to call this blade of grass underscore alpha, or you could just do underscore A, and I'm going to save it. In the image compression, I'm going to use LZW compression. When you have grayscale, that's a great compression. And we're going to go back and save a copy then of the color. And I'm going to turn off layers, save it as a copy. I'm going to include the profile and save it. No compression. Now I also want to save a Photoshop version of this so I can come back and work on it later if needed. And we'll do that as a PSD file. Also, it is a good idea. We were using smart objects before, so when I cropped it, it didn't cut out that layer. So what I'm going to do is go back and crop, just to make sure that all that extra information that we're not using is not part of the image file, and I'm going to resave it. Another thing I want to mention is before I did the exposure in order to change the coloration along with the vibrance, but you can set up the filters within the layers directly too. So I could add an exposure layer, and then with the adjustments panel open, I can adjust these settings, and that way I'm not removing any of the color information from the current image. So depending on how much or if you're going to be going back and editing anything, it is a good way to set things up. I'm pretty certain about the settings I'm going to have, so I just went ahead and directly applied it to the layer. I do want to note that this image does have a bit small section that has some brown spots on it. Because of the way we're designing these leaves, that's actually going to end up showing on every single leaf. So if you do want to remove it and make it a little more even, or maybe have only one texture out of the different subsets have that imperfection, we could use the first color we saved as the imperfect one, and if you want to correct this, a really easy thing you can do is using the healing brush tool. Hold down Alt and make a selection along the side, and we can just use that healing brush along the edge. So that will take care of that showing up on every single blade of grass. You could also go into shadows and highlights if you want to remove some of the extra highlights on the edge, but for the most part this should work all right. There's a little bit of dust and everything on it too, a little bit of grain. Whether or not you want to remove that, it's up to you. You can use a couple of different filters for that. You can go to noise, you could despeckle it, Dust and scratches works alright. Reduce noise is a great filter, making sure that you leave the preserved detail amount at a decent amount, otherwise you're going to end up creating a very blotchy look for the surface, and when you use reduce noise too many times, it becomes pretty obvious that it's been used. Also, this image is still huge, so I'm probably going to go and load in those copies I just saved and scale them down. But I also want to keep the original, so I'll end up making duplicate copies. So I'm going to go ahead and, just to save and close this, we can close out that alpha that we just used to save, and then open up from the content directory. And these are about 5,000 pixels high, and we definitely don't need it that high. So what I'm going to do is rescale them, and depending on the interpolation type you have, Control K on the keyboard, general image interpolation, and I have mine set to bilinear. Because we're going to be reducing the scale, even though we'll use the image size, it will give us a choice. These methods are really more for direct editing, but with the smart object it kind of automatically chooses. So you could go ahead and switch it that way if you wanted to scale directly within the interface, but what I'm going to do is go to image size, and let's go ahead and set the height to 768. And I'm going to do bicubic sharper on the color. And then go ahead and save this as small, so it's another file. So I don't want to overwrite the larger one in case I need it. We can do resampling within view, but these are pretty large to begin with, so I do want to have some smaller versions to be able to load in. If we need a really close-up version of the plant, then we can have separate species closer to the camera with these really high-resolution images if needed. So going back to the height, 768, and in this case, I don't want to use the bicubic sharper because then I'm going to have to go around and probably edit the edge. Actually, one thing we can do is invert it first, go to image size, and then if we change the height, we can use bicubic sharper. And we shouldn't have any edge pixels added. When there's black on the edge, sometimes it'll give a white anti-aliased appearance. Now keeping in mind that because we've resampled it, it is no longer that two-tone or just black and white, so we will need to modify this before we save it. So Control L, pull up levels, and what I'm going to do is take the gamma and increase it, and then pull that lower section up, and that should be pretty close to where I need. If we need to, sometimes you can use a higher resolution alpha and just keep the color map a little bit smaller if it's too jagged. But these are individual blades of grass. It should work out pretty well. So I'm going to switch this over to the bitmap mode, 50% threshold, and then switch it back to grayscale. And then we can go ahead and save it. So this one is inverted. I'm going to go back, Control I to switch that back, just so it's consistent with the other one. And we might have to invert it within view. We'll go ahead and see. So just adding that small extension, and save it, LZW compression. And now we are going to go into view and set up the texture maps on that lily of the valley species.